Hi, welcome to another Riverside Chat for SacTV.com. I'm Alex Cosper. Today I want to talk about indie music, what it means to Sacramento. I played a role in indie music here in town back in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s, I actually, while working on the air at KWOD 106.5, I actually had my own hit record. It was called Waves on the West Coast, and it was billed as AC and Harrison Price, Tangent with AC and Harrison Price, who was the producer. And that was really my first musical production. Waves on the West Coast, laying in the sand. And we played it on the air, and it got lots of requests in the summer of '89. That's how I knew that a local band that isn't signed to any label could make it on the air in Sacramento. Now, prior to that, there were some local hits on the radio. One that comes to mind was Carry Me Back by Crayon in 1980. It was played on KXOA AM. At the time, that was 1470 AM. And I remember hearing it a lot and knowing it was a local hit, and even seeing the band perform on television. So it definitely made a splash in 1980. And a little before that, there were examples of indie records from Sacramento that kind of touched the national scene. But really the hits that came out of Sacramento tended to be on major labels, like More Today Than Yesterday by Spiral Staircase. That was in 1969. They had already moved to LA, from Sacramento, and then had a big hit. And then of course, we had lots of solo artists develop out of this city, like Timothy B. Schmidt became the bassist for the Eagles in 1979. And sang I Can't Tell You Why, one of their most incredible ballads. And really, I mean, that would be the high mark for Sacramento as far as music that came from people who were from Sacramento, that made it to the national scene. There were other examples of hits like You Don't Want Me Anymore by Steel Breeze, a national hit in 1982. The list goes on, of course. Then the KWOD era, when I started playing music. I was the program director at KWOD starting in 1991, so I had the most influence on the music that got played on the station. I was the one who actually picked the music. So I wanted to help the local scene, and one of the first ways I did that was start a local music show called The Sound of Sacramento. And I did that with a local musician named Morris Knight, who went on to become a very well-known radio personality in San Francisco. Still makes music. And it was David Conley who suggested we do a local show. He ended up hosting the show eventually in the 90s, and then he moved to Monterey, and he's one of the top performing artists there. Works at a club called the Sardine Factory, and plays piano and covers songs and originals nightly. So getting back to KWOD, so we put together the local show, and from there we started giving airplay to all these bands, like on Sunday night at 9 p.m. Deftones were an early band that got airplay on the station for that show, along with Jack, which later became Oleander and got signed to a national label. And Cake. We played Cake in regular rotation starting around 1994. The song Rock and Roll Lifestyle. 94, 95, we just started playing a lot of Cake music from that album, Motorcade of Generosity. It was a big selling album, and it got them signed. It was an indie label, Capricorn, and it got them signed to a major label, Columbia. But then they eventually went back to being on their own indie label. So I think indie music, some people think of it as just underground music or weird music. Some people think of it as just punk music. But the reality is when I think of indie music, and this is the way I've thought about it all along, it just means independent from the general mainstream system of music, okay? In that sense, the Beatles were an independent band in the sense that the label, EMI, the EMI / Parlophone for the UK and Capitol for the US, gave them their own label, which was Apple Records, starting in 1968. So they created their own label with that, funded by the big guys, of course, at EMI. But they found some great artists. I mean, James Taylor, Badfinger, Mary Hopkin, Billy Preston. So the Beatles found great music. And even though, again, they were part of one of the biggest labels, that label gave them, the freedom to put together their own label. And in that sense, I think that's indie. You know, there's several situations like in the 90s. Warner Brothers, of course, was a huge label, still is. And they had lots of subsidiaries, like over 30 subsidiaries. And some of those were really intense, like indie-oriented labels, like Reprise and Sire. And at KWOD, because we were an alternative station, we were top 40 in the 80s and then alternative in the 90s. We played a lot of music from those labels, Warner, Reprise, and Sire. And so, yeah, it doesn't matter if it's backed by big money, as long as the music itself is very independent of the mainstream, very unique. That's the way I saw the Beatles, as being super unique. And it is a stretch to call them indie when they're on one of the biggest labels, but they were independent-minded. They cut against the grain. Every album they put out, like from 65 on, from Rubber Soul on, was going against whatever the mainstream was. So they basically helped expand the mainstream because of that. They injected it with a lot more diversity. But as far as Sacramento, I would say Cake was kind of like the Beatles of Sacramento so far, because we played so many of their songs on KWOD. Rock and Roll Lifestyle, Jolene, You Part the Waters. They just had several. And then I left the station in '96, and they continued to put out good music that got airplay on KWOD. One of their most popular songs was a cover of the big disco hit I Will Survive, originally recorded by Gloria Gaynor. Yeah, they did a fun cover of that song. But the fact that Cake made it, I think the reason they made it is because they were really into playing live a lot and developing a live following. And they got their fans to sing along with their songs. That's what impressed me the most about the band when I saw them at the Cattle Club back in the early 90s. That's what made me want to play a bunch of their songs, because I knew that their fans knew their songs so well they could sing along with them at shows. Now, as far as songwriting, well, I'm a songwriter myself and a musician, so I like to dabble in indie music, and I'm definitely working on my first real album, I would say. It'll be distributed through DistroKid, online music distribution service. What I really want to see happen is indie music rise above regular corporate music, just at least on a local level. So that, like, there are scenes of people that really appreciate the homegrown music of their region. And so there was hope recently in early August 2023. A guy named Oliver Anthony, a guy from nowhere, I guess West Virginia, released a song through DistroKid on August 11th, and it was called The Rich Men North of Richmond. And if you're not familiar with Richmond, that was the capital of the Confederacy, capital of Virginia back in the Civil War. But he wasn't really like preaching the rise of the Confederacy again. That's how it was mistaken by certain media outlets. And I guess conservatives thought the song was tipping his hat to the conservatives by, I guess, putting down taxes. But he was really talking about the struggle of the middle class. He wasn't putting himself in the elites at all. So he basically ended up on the Joe Rogan show trying to clarify that he was not making a political statement with his song, and was not trying to cater to one movement or the other. He was just singing his feelings in a song about the struggle to live with the rising cost of living these days. So anyway, indie music, kind of like the Beatles, sang about society, and that kind of set them apart from a lot of bands from their era. They kind of borrowed from folk music in that sense, and kind of were heavily influenced by Bob Dylan in that sense. So I think the future of indie music, where there are ways to make waves happen, are those indie artists who want to say something in their music that nobody else is saying, or do something with music beyond the same four chords that all the top artists of this century keep pounding out. It's like there's like 5 chord progressions of 4 chords repeating over and over and over and over and over again. And that's become a top 40 music formula of this century. So one way to define yourself as indie is to be the exact opposite of that. You know, maybe still use certain chord progressions, but don't just stick with the same stock 4 chords over and over and over again that have been used in hundreds of songs. Like, try to go beyond just the boundaries. That's what indie has always meant to me, going beyond the boundaries, and really taking music beyond the orange pylon. So that's it for now. Let's get together again soon for another Riverside Chat.